So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Murphy, President of Ipsos's Marketing Strategy and Understanding Research Group. Chris, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks so much, Ellen. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on the eve of Election Day. So we thought it would be quite interesting if we took our commercial brand measurement toolkit and actually applied it to these politicians, brand Biden, brand Trump, Harris, and Pence, and see what we might learn here. So about a month ago, we went out and interviewed 1,000 likely voters in the United States. And we thought we had a pretty good feel for where the candidates were kind of coming down in terms of their brand scores. And then a funny thing happened that we didn't anticipate. The president actually was diagnosed with COVID and ended up spending an entire weekend at Walter Reed. So we took a look at that and said, okay, pretty good chance that that might impact our results. So we better go back to field, which we did shortly thereafter. So what you're seeing today is actually an accumulation of those two waves of fielding, and we'll comment as we go in terms of what changed or maybe what didn't change from wave one to wave two. Now, the specific questions that we were really setting out to address here is, one, what kind of equity do these two brands especially have? So to address that, we use something called Brand Value Creator. Some Ipsos clients might be familiar with that. That is a validated tool that can be administered quite quickly to help us understand attitudinal equity and commitment to brands. Second big question that we set out to answer was, what perceptual spaces are really uniquely owned by these candidates? And to get there, we used a technique called brand mental networks. It's used to really understand kind of the spontaneous associations that people have with commercial brands. So we use that technique here on the politicians. And then the third big objective was, okay, what's driving preference for each candidate? Personality traits, policy kind of commitments, that type of deal. And for that, we used a technique that you might not be familiar with. It's called multi-choice response time, codename MCRT. And what that does is it helps us understand implicit associations via speed of attribution. So in the bottom of the screen here, we've got a little example of what it might look like in a sparkling soft drink type of scenario where you've got a brand attribute sitting in the middle of the screen, surrounded by the brands. And what we're looking at or looking for from the respondent is not just their attribution, but also the order in which they endorse brands, and most importantly, the speed with which they endorse brands. So we're using that technique here to really understand how fast people make those associations, how implicit those associations are, and then linking that to what's really driving voter preference. Okay.
So before we dive into that, let's level set a little bit with where our public opinion data is telling us the race is at the moment, so you can sort of have an understanding of how this brand tool separates from that analysis. So this election has actually been remarkable for just how stable it has been. Joe Biden has maintained a somewhere between 8 or 9 percentage point lead over Donald Trump for pretty much the whole campaign. The margin has varied slightly to narrow to maybe 6 points to as wide as 11 or so points, but it has been remarkably stable, and that's a big difference than in 2016, where we saw Hillary Clinton's lead jump out to almost 10 points after the Access Hollywood tapes, and then narrow over the course of 4 weeks to only about 3 percentage points in the days before the election. So at this point in time, we're still seeing Joe Biden up over Donald Trump by about 8 points nationally. Our next round of data, which will be coming out today, is going to have Joe Biden up about 8. And that's sort of what we're seeing in the data as we're going into election day tomorrow. But this exercise of using our brand tools really helps uncover some ways of looking at these candidates that we don't really see in our standard political polling exercises.
Yeah. And so, Chris, just to clarify, the latest data that you had access to this morning has actually got this tightening a little bit, right? Was it?
I mean, a point.
Okay,
That's
52.44.
sample noise as much as anything.
Got it. Thanks. All right. So as we make the pivot then from the question of who are you going to vote for, because that's what you're looking at here, to when we look at it through an attitudinal equity lens, we see the race start to narrow a bit. Biden's still in the lead, but we come up with this metric that we call share of desire, right? So again, getting at something a little bit different than who are you going to vote for. And when we do that, Biden has got a 52 to 48 lead nationally. And you might say, well, why are these numbers tighter than the ones you just saw? Well, one of the contributing questions to the BVC summary metric of brand desire is closeness. So we'll ask people on a 1 to 10 point scale, how close do you feel to Donald Trump? How close do you feel to Joe Biden? And what we're seeing here is that the top box scores, the people giving Trump a 10 amongst his voter base, is actually 41%. For Biden, if you look at people who are drawn to him and intend to vote for him, he's only getting a 26% top box score. So, if you look at things on it from a total sample standpoint, Biden scores a little bit better on this thing. But when you start to isolate down and look at the intensity in the scores, you see that the Trump base is more intensely favorable toward its candidate than the Biden camp is towards its own. Another thing that we're not showing you here are the extreme negatives. So if I look at the Biden voters and say, okay, how do you feel about Donald Trump in terms of closeness? 88% of them say Trump would get a 1 or a bottom box score. If you do the same thing amongst Trump voters and say, hey, what do you think about Biden? That number's in the 70s. The point being, all the intensity here around the endpoints of the scale is around brand Trump. Now, another very interesting question that we asked that's kind of related is, who is your favorite public figure? And for this question, we opened up the field a bit. So for Democrats, they could say Obama, they could say Bernie Sanders. And what you can see there is on the left, the Democrats respond almost in a 3-to-1 ratio for Obama, right? So just to be very clear, when you're asking voters to pick their favorite public figure from this list, Democrats are 3 times more likely to say Barack Obama than they are to say Joe Biden. And while we're not showing the data here explicitly, you also see a dynamic amongst younger voters where folks are at least 2 times more likely to say Bernie Sanders than Joe Biden. So again, it kind of goes back to that intensity of preference issue that we were talking about a moment ago. On the Republican side, on the other hand, you see that 59% of Republicans say that Donald Trump is their favorite public figure right now. And if you compare that to George Bush, you've got kind of this 4x relationship, 4 times relationship. Now, comparing Bush and Obama, obviously not entirely fair. One's been out of office for 12 years, one's only been out of office for 4. But it does kind of reinforce this point about intensity of preference, intensity of kind of a share of desire, towards the 2 remaining candidates. Okay. Earlier, I talked about the brand mental network approach. Now, what we're doing here is a very simple question. We're just asking people, hey, what pops into your mind when you think about Joe Biden? What pops into your mind when you think about Donald Trump? And we just let them free associate. The way to interpret this slide, because I realize there's a lot going on here, but the large blue circles are representing the 2 candidates. The associations on the left are mentions only for Joe Biden. The stuff in the middle gets mentioned for both candidates, and then the stuff on the right was only mentioned for Donald Trump. Now, the larger the circle that's sitting beside an attribute or verbiage, that means that word was used more frequently to describe that candidate. And the thicker the line, the tighter the association between the word and the candidate. So what you find when you look at this thing is there aren't that many really clear and unique associations with candidate Biden. Now there are references to his age, as you can see, on the left there, and there are some positives around being a caring individual. But you're going to see this again when we turn our attention to some of the implicit attributes. Brand Biden is basically lacking in definition. The brand is a bit nondescript. Now, that's not the case with brand Trump, where we are seeing much more uniquely associated positives and negatives, right? So on the positive side of the ledger, some people see him as a brave American businessman who can support the economy. But on the negative side of the ledger, and coming through just as strongly, he's seen by many as arrogant, rude, dishonest, and some people even view him as racist, right? So again, consistent with the point we made on the last slide, all the intensity of associations are running through brand Trump. And one very important thing to point out that's not on this slide. Remember I told you earlier that we went to field twice because of Trump's COVID diagnosis and the time that he spent in the hospital recovering. That story dominated headlines for 4 straight days in the United States. Every network, you couldn't escape that story, right? So we go back out the very next week and say, what pops into your mind when you think about Donald Trump? You would think that some mention of coronavirus might come up. It barely makes a dent. So the point being that the Trump brand is quite indelibly etched in the consumer psyche, so much so that even a 4-day stay in Walter Reed by the President of the United States didn't impact the associations that people were spontaneously sharing with us in these exercises.
I would add, Chris, just very quickly as Cliff, that this just shows and reinforces our already existing view that you either love Trump or you hate them. We're going to see some data that Chris is going to show in a bit, showing that this just reinforces the point. It could have been Biden. It could have been another candidate there. This election is really about Trump. It's a referendum on Trump and brand Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Cliff. Okay. Now, earlier we talked about that little MCRT approach. Again, stands for multi-choice response time. We're using implicit attribution, speed-based techniques to understand what's really driving brand preference here, right? So what we've got here basically are 4 categories of drivers, and they are telling a story of voter attraction and voter repulsion. So if we move from left to right, I'll kind of tell you how to interpret each of these boxes. The positive things about Joe Biden that are pulling voters towards him are captured there in dark blue. The negative things about Trump that are pushing people towards brand Biden are captured in that lighter shade of blue. The negatives about Biden that are pushing people towards Trump, those are in light red. And then the stuff in dark red, these are the positive things about Trump that are drawing people towards his brand. So if I back it up and move the other way now, starting with brand Trump, most of those who are voting for him are drawn to him because he feels like they feel like he safeguards the American dream. His supporters also see him as bold, generally good for the economy, intelligent, and somebody who really respects law and order and is willing to fight political correctness, which a lot of Republicans see as kind of a scourge on our times. Now, there are a few Biden negatives that are pushing voters towards Trump, but collectively and relatively, they aren't having much impact. And the size of these 4 boxes, they're important here. Because they demonstrate the relative importance of these 4 attribute groupings. So hopefully that's clear. So this skinny little pink box, where folks are giving Biden a hard time for being irresponsible, boring, it's not having much impact in terms of where people actually intend to cast their vote or where their brand preference lies. Now, the stuff pulling folks towards Trump, that is quite strong. But look at the size of the push Trump box, right? So you got a lot of people who feel like he is corrupt, reckless, an arrogant liar, that are pushing people towards brand Biden. So a lot of the relative importance, a lot of the driver impact in this model are negatives about Donald that are pushing people towards Biden. Now, Biden's positives, they're not trivial by any means. His qualifications, his likability, they are playing a meaningful role in attracting voters his way. But as you're going to see in some data I'm going to show you in just a moment, it's a bit more muted than some of the positives associated with Trump. So hopefully this is clear. We got kind of the four big groupings, the pull, the push, that story of kind of attraction and repulsion. So I'm going to pause.
I just want to add, just to emphasize, just to repeat again, it's all about Trump and brand Trump. Either you love him or you hate him. Biden's important on the margins, but it's about attraction and repulsion. That's this.
Cliff, one of the questions that we're getting is, have you ever seen any other election where you've seen such polarizing figures? U.S., elsewhere, just anything come to mind?
Yes, such a polarizing figure, because in some ways we are very polarized as a society. But what we see more specifically when it comes to brand Trump and Biden, brand Trump is extremely polarizing. And so from that perspective, Lula da Silva in Brazil, extremely polarizing individual. You either loved him or hated him. Obviously it was based on class and other sorts of characteristics, very much so. Chavez in Venezuela as well, a very, very polarizing figure. You either love him or you hate him. They hated him. And those are just two examples, though what I would say is, at least in my experience, the juxtaposition are there, the love-hate, the polars are much more extreme with Trump than even these two figures.
So, yeah, no, that makes sense. Thanks, Cliff. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the detail behind some of these data now. So if you look at folks who are polled to Trump, and intend to vote for him, 88% of them say he would support economic growth. 86% see him as bold, strong. 83% see him as safeguarding the American dream, respecting law and order, fighting political correctness, et cetera. So the numbers are really, really high. And try to keep this graphic in your head when I flip to the next chart, because I want to make a comparison of what you're seeing here to what you see with brand Biden. And as I mentioned before, there's a little bit of action in the model of where people are being pushed away from brand Biden because he's perceived as old, boring, irresponsible. Keep in mind, this is the percentage of people who intend to vote for Trump who see Biden in this way. So 80% of the folks who intend to vote for Trump see Biden as old, 66% say he's boring, 62% see him as irresponsible. But again, in terms of just the power in the driver model, this stuff is marginal, okay? But now we flip the page and we go, okay, let's look at some of those specific numbers that are driving the negatives. So if I look at the folks who are intending to vote for Biden and I look at their perceptions of Donald Trump, 96% think he's a liar, 95% say he's an arrogant, bully, reckless, 94% say him as corrupt, 93% say he's racist, 89% say he's narrow-minded. And then if you look at those who are polled towards Biden, you see 67% say, yeah, he's qualified, 65% like it, that he respects one's right to protest, 58% say, he'll stand up for people like you, 57% say he's likable and trustworthy. But compare, these numbers in dark blue on this screen to the numbers that you saw on this screen, right? So the people who are in the Trump camp are just very intensely, pro-Trump on all these matters. The folks who are in the pro-Biden camp, there's just not that same intensity on the positive side. But on the negative side, you're almost at consensus levels there, in terms of the negative imagery that's consistently coming through on Trump. So, Cliff, another question for you here. There's kind of this I guess, narrative out there, and it's been out for about 4 years about the quote, shy Trump voter. Do you believe they're out there? Are they still out there? Is this a myth? When you look at data like this, what do you think?
Well, first and foremost, I'm not seeing any shy Trump voters out there. I have a bunch in my neighborhood that are driving around in cars with flags waving. So, no, I actually think that that's more of a myth than a reality. What I would say, if we're talking specifically about applying a questionnaire, administering a questionnaire, and someone sort of either lying or hiding their answer, I think that's a myth here in the United States. Now, I already mentioned Chavez in Venezuela, a more authoritarian society,
Yep.
and there you have individuals hiding with undecideds because they're scared to give their opinion. That's an example of shy voters. No, much more probably, especially in 2016, if we're talking about it, it was much more we couldn't get a hold of or couldn't find some of the Trump voters. They were in the nooks and crannies and the hollers and difficult places to reach. They didn't answer the phones or respond to email. Probably was much more an issue, technically speaking, of non-response or coverage bias. I think we've done a pretty good job. If Chris Jackson wants to jump in and sort of add to that, we've done a pretty good job as a polling industry, we think, but we'll see, of resolving those more methodological issues. But if there's anything like a shy voter, Trump voter, it's that we miss them. It's not that they somehow hid their answer on the questionnaire when responding.
Yeah, and to that point, some of the questions we got, one was asking actually if we're waiting to education within race, which is one of the things that the research community thought was one of the issues that led to understating Trump support in 2016. Ipsos certainly is in all of our research using that intersection between race and ethnicity and educational attainments. But we're also taking an approach where we're sort of looking at a lot of other sort of politically important demographic groups and making sure that we're doing things that to ensure they're represented in our surveys at an appropriate level. Another just simple operational question. Someone asked if the words old were applied to Trump. All of these words were actually applied to both candidates. So there was actually a list of about 50 personality attributes and policy positions and other things that people could ascribe to both candidates. And old popped for Biden, didn't really pop for Trump quite as strongly. And then a question for you, Chris. Are there examples from the traditional brand world with a similar love-hate sentiment that we see for Trump in this data?
Just kind of in terms of the push away, my answer would be kind of similar to Cliff's earlier, not with this extremity, right? I can think back to the crisis of 2008, 2009, some of the sentiment towards certain financial institutions in that period. There were some extreme negatives that pushed people away from certain brands in that era. There have been others, who've had product failures, recalls, mishaps that have created kind of short-term swings where people get pushed away from the brand for a stretch. But usually there's a recovery period there. Again, I've not seen anything as ingrained and protracted as what we're seeing here. This is one of a kind. Yeah, great question though. Any others, Chris, that we need to? I don't want to ignore the questions as we move on.
One other asking if they're shy Biden voters this year.
Oh,
Polls.
Interesting. Cliff, you want that one?
I think why don't I kick it over to Chris?
I mean, we'll find out. We'll find out at some point in the next couple of days if polls are understating Biden's support. In a different talk where we spend more time on election polls, Cliff and I would spend a lot of time talking about certainty and the amount of certainty you can have in an election poll. And I do think that I think there's a lot of variables going into Biden's support that are harder to account for than in Trump's support. And some of it we can see here, right, where people voting for Trump are voting for Trump, whereas people voting for Biden are really voting against Trump. And because of that, it makes Biden's support actually somewhat more volatile. So it could be lower, it could be much higher. So yes, there is, I think, the potential that Biden overperforms where his polls are, but I don't know if that's necessarily because of a shy Biden voter where they're not telling us their intent in the polls.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, and I'm going to offer a personal observation on this one. I think we're accurately capturing this stuff in our survey metrics now and in our sampling strategies now. But when it comes to a quote shy Biden voter, I think there's a social interpretation of that. I live in the state of Tennessee. I'm a Nashvilleian, and as many of you know, that's a red state. There is a lot of social pressure to kind of conform to the Trump way of thinking here, and if you say something that is pro-Biden, that comes with some social risk in some circles. So to that extent, there might be some certain shyness that's out there. Again, I don't think it is manifesting in polls, but I do think it's manifesting in people's day-to-day behaviors in different ways. Great question. Okay, let's keep going.
Sorry, this wasn't for me. And I think one of the things that speaks to the intensity of feeling about particularly Trump, but positive and negative, is just how much Americans are living in sort of alternate realities. These are just some illustrations from two surveys that we conducted about the same time that we did this research. One is actually from an Axios Ipsos coronavirus survey where we're asking about information about coronavirus. The others from our Reuters Ipsos political tracker. And what we're asking is, on the one, do people believe the official data on the number of people who've died of COVID, is that accurate or overstated? And if we look at people by partisanship, which is of course the key sort of thing determining people's bubbles these days, but then cross that where they get their primary source of TV news from, we see that there's these huge differences in people's belief in some of these things. Particularly for this question, is the official COVID-19 death toll exaggerated? We see that Republicans who get their news primarily from Fox, 2/3 of them believe it's exaggerated, versus only 1/3 of Republicans who get their news from the mainstream nightly news broadcasts. And just think of that, like just how different this is, even among Republicans, right? Even among people who are Trump voters who sort of generally have the same worldview, just the information source drives this huge impact. You see similar patterns among independents who watch Fox versus not. Unfortunately, few enough Democrats, well, fortunately, no judgment, but few Democrats watch Fox News, so you can't break that out as a demographic group. And we see the same behavior when we ask about views of Trump's handling of coronavirus. Republicans who get their news from Fox, overwhelmingly 9 out of 10 say he's doing a good job. Republicans who don't get their news from Fox, only about 2/3 say he's doing a good job. And a similar pattern among independents, where independents who get their news from Fox are more likely than independents who don't to believe that Trump's doing a good job. So this just, I think, illustrates in a couple of data points these filter bubbles that exist, and I'm sure you've heard about, that are reinforcing the power of these brands that we see in these other studies. And like part of the reason Trump's brand is so strong is he's functionally had a 24/7 advertising channel pushing it for the last 5 years in a way that I think, we'd all envy having that much ad spend behind anything that we're doing. And that's really helped to reinforce and underline the strength of his brand.
Yeah, that is a fascinating chart. We will send out this presentation to everybody, but maybe take a screenshot of this one. This one just blows my mind. I guess I've known this to be true kind of intuitively, but I've never seen the figures spelled out quite so explicitly. But it really helps you understand this next slide. Because we might think, okay, COVID is such a defining theme of 2020, right? That you would expect that it would define these two candidate brands as well, but it doesn't. In fact, one's worldview and ingoing brand preference seems to totally dictate your perceived performance of each candidate. You just saw the slide that Chris Jackson showed. 89% of folks who are getting their news from Fox are saying, "Oh, Trump's doing a great job on COVID." Similarly, when we ask Trump voters, Who's going to do the best job with coronavirus? Well, what do you know? The vast majority say Trump. When we ask likely Biden voters who's going to do the best job with coronavirus, well, the vast majority say Biden. And then even when you look at undecided voters, and there aren't that many of them these days, right? It's a handful. Was it like 5-6%, Chris?
3%.
Sorry, go ahead.
3% today.
Okay, it keeps going down. So it's a small percentage of the electorate, but even amongst those, 2/3 say, I don't see it different. The point being, the brand perception really isn't largely being colored by performance on COVID. The brand perception was defined coming in. And this is just fascinating. Now, this is a fellow Nashvilleian. I don't know if you all are familiar with John Meacham or not. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner and reporter. He used to be the editor-in-chief at Newsweek, and he's a sharp guy. He's got a new documentary out on this topic, and this is a great quote from him in the documentary where he says, "Look, we react to things because of where we stand, not because of what they are." And that quote just really grabbed me, especially after seeing, some of the data that Chris Jackson was sharing just a moment ago, because you think about confirmation bias, right? The textbook definition of that's a tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of our existing beliefs, right? That's the deal. So much of what we're seeing here is that in action. In fact, Meacham goes on to say that, partisan reactions to incoming data are so strong that it's almost impossible for somebody to interpret a new story or a new report in a data-driven way. It's all about where you already stand that colors your interpretation of events and the way that they're told to you. So, is coronavirus a key topic on voters' mind? Is it the kind of defining topic of 2020 and likely 2020? Well, yes, it is, but it's not defining these two brands. As Chris was saying a moment ago, both sides are really living in their own reality. And remember what I showed you on that brand mental network, graphic. Coronavirus didn't come up at all, even after Trump had spent the weekend in a hospital suffering from it. So look, the camps are entrenched. It's clearly more about emotion than policy. I think that's another thing that you might have noticed was absent from the brand mental networks, from the driver analytics. Policy issues aren't really driving selection here near so much as emotion. With that, I think Cliff would love kind of your reaction to what Meacham is saying here about reacting to things because of where we stand, because of rather than what they are.
Yeah, once again, I think that ultimately this is an election about sort of whether you love Trump or you hate him. It's interesting, sort of the coalition we have is kind of the coalition of a willing that are negative to Trump. We've got sort of never Trumpers, remote Republican. We've got all stripes in there. Let's ultimately see if it's successful. Obviously, we'll see tomorrow. But this is really, once again, a reaction to Trump. It's a referendum on Trump, and Trump defines the line. And you make a decision whether you're on one side or the other side, but it's not about Biden. It's not about policy specifically. It's about style and over substance in some ways, though, if you think of substance on a certain level of institutions, perhaps. And so, yeah, I think this is a very kind of telling point. I know kind of he's been making this point repeatedly over the last couple of years, but this is a very interesting election that way.
Yeah.
Whereas just the caveat is 2016 was actually about a very different agenda. And the agenda was a Make America Great agenda, which was about restricting immigration and tax cuts and a whole host of other sorts of specific issues and policies. But this one is much more about whether you stand with the man or you don't.
Thanks, Cliff. Interesting question. We posed this several weeks ago, right? I said, how do you plan to vote? And we found that the majority of Democrats said they're going to do it at a distance. And we found the majority of Republicans said, I'm going to show up in person. And this was very consistent with other data that we've been collecting. We do this global study called Essentials, and in the US slice of that sample, we found that Republicans are 2, 3, sometimes up to 5 times more likely to say they are ready to re-engage in almost every tactile experience that you can think of. So going to a ball game, getting on an airplane, staying at a hotel, you name it. Republicans are much more likely to say, yeah, I'm ready to do that now. I'm ready to do that tomorrow. Democrats are much more likely to say, well, I'd rather not jump into that stuff just yet. So not a big surprise, that you would see here that most Democrats intend to vote at a distance. Most Republicans plan to actually show up in person. Now, I think when we first saw this, in combination with some of that brand intensity data that we were looking at before that showed that, the Trump camp was just so fired up about him, and the Biden camp was a little bit more tepid towards Biden, but just, very anti-Trump. We wondered if this might have some type of impact in terms of voter participation. But I would think, based on what we've seen here in the last few days in terms of early returns, that might not quite be the case. But I will turn that question to somebody who knows a heck of a lot more about that than me. Chris Jackson, can you react to that? Do you think that early mail-in voting, all this activity that we're seeing, would you think that kind of tilts to the Democratic side?
Looking at our survey data, yes, I think, we've seen 97 million votes already received as of this morning. Just huge number of votes that have been cast and received early. And our survey data and most other survey data suggests that early vote is going for the Democrats by a pretty substantial margin over the Republicans. However, it does look like Republicans, of the vote that is remaining of people saying that they're intending to vote in person tomorrow, it looks like they have a substantial advantage. So I think of the early vote, we have data that suggests that Biden's leading probably 3-2 in the early vote, but Trump would be leading 3-2 in the vote that would be cast on Election Day tomorrow, which is, incidentally, if you're watching or following election coverage, one of the reasons everyone's talking about how we need to be very cautious about jumping to conclusions early, because depending on how a specific state does their election tallies, if they count early vote first, Biden's going to jump to this huge lead that then will decline as they count the in-person on Election Day ballots. And if they do it the other way, we'll see Trump jump to a huge lead early as they count the Election Day returns, and then the absentee ballots are counted into the total. We'll see Biden catch up. So we will have to give the election professionals time to count everything up, because we are seeing certainly a lot of variables going into the election this year. But this slide that we have up in front of you just, I think, illustrates some of the things that are underneath those top line numbers you see released about the elections. That show some of the places where uncertainty continues to exist. For instance, among, and this is actually data that's about a week and a half old already, but among Biden supporters, for instance, there's many more of them who've already voted, so there's fewer of them that still need to go to the polls. Among Trump voters, there's more that still need to go vote, and there's varying levels of certainty, right? Do those people show up? Does a hurricane hit somewhere, or some sort of inclement weather that causes them not to be able to go vote? Uncertainty that exists, right? And then when we ask about how likely are they to vote for that candidate, there's ranges of certainty. We don't see a huge margin between Biden and Trump on those, but it certainly exists. And then to actually speak to it, one of the questions we just received, we're actually seeing very few undecided voters this year, particularly compared to 2016. In 2016, there was about 15% of the electorate a week out was undecided. Even going into Election Day, it was still somewhere between 10 and 12% who are undecided. This year, it looks like it's only 3 to 5%. 5% as we go into tomorrow. That's still undecided. And of that 3 to 5%, they do look to be breaking more evenly between Trump and Biden. So it doesn't look like it'll have the same effect that 2016 had, where Trump made up a lot of ground over Clinton in the last week of undecided voters breaking in his direction. So yeah, I think we still, we have to count up all the votes, but we are still seeing a potential range of outcomes, everything from Trump narrowly eking out a win in the Electoral College because he has such a fired up base of support, and Biden's people, because they're not really about Biden, sort of maybe not totally coming through, to Biden winning in a landslide because of the antipathy towards Trump pushing them to vote.
Very good. And Chris, one of the questions coming in, this is a factual one. You're better placed to answer this than me, but is it correct that ballots in Arizona, Florida, Michigan, and Wisconsin have to be received by November 3rd to be counted?
It depends on the state. Each state has its own rules, but for most states, the ballot has to be received on election day, oftentimes by a specific time on election day. So like in Wisconsin, it has to be 8 p.m. Central Time, local time, for it to count. However, there's some other states like Pennsylvania, it can be actually up to 3 days. It can be, has to be postmarked on election day, and it can arrive up to 3 days later. So the rules are variable, and that will probably affect things. Now, again, the 97 million I mentioned a moment ago, that's ballots that have already been received by election officials, right? So already election officials have received a historic level of early vote. But there is, I think, probably still remaining a large number. There's something like 30 million ballots had been requested, early vote ballots have been requested that have not been returned yet. So there's certainly a large number that are still outstanding. Maybe they never get returned. That's always happens in elections. But yes, these sort of rules can certainly also play into how the results pan out.
Got it. So if you've got, say another 30 million come through, and you're at roughly 125, how many people do you actually think turn up on election day?
Well, so people who study this a lot closer than we do are estimating that we're going to see a turnout of somewhere around 155 million this year, which is a historic level of turnouts. And most people who've ever voted in an American election, the total turnout level would be about 65% of the vote age population, which would be the highest turnout percentage since in about a century. So, really high levels of turnout, but that suggests that we'll probably see another 50 to 60 million people come out and vote tomorrow, which, is fewer actually than voted in 2016, because in 2016, the election day vote was actually closer to 90 million people who came out. So fewer people voting in person, but still, lots and lots of people coming out.
Got it. Thanks, Chris. All right, so to make some closing comments, and then we can do a few questions if we have a moment. As Cliff said before, the election is dominated by the Trump brand, right? Right now, based on our equity calculations, Biden does have a modest advantage, and a lot of his supporters appear motivated to action by Trump negatives. I think when I looked at this data a few weeks ago, I was like, well, negative avoidance is a little bit of a risky strategy, but it actually does seem to be translating to participation. There are some vulnerabilities here, though, right? The brand is nondescript. There is a lack of intense favorability around Joe. And there's also this extreme fondness for Obama. In a lot of ways, Democrats are still dreaming of the Obama days, right? That 3-to-1 relationship in terms of your favorite political figure. And if I were managing the Biden brand, I'm not. But I think there were some things he probably could have done to have strengthened some of his positive associations as very clear antidotes to some of the Trump negatives, as opposed to relying purely on the negatives. But if you flip the ledger over to brand Trump, As we mentioned before, especially after looking at that brand mental network data after he comes out of the hospital, obviously this brand is etched in the psyche, right? And while the comparative intensity of his voter base is super strong and relatively more powerful than what we see for Biden, and it seems that that's also going to translate to participation, right? They are very likely to show up in person. A lot of them will turn up tomorrow to vote. It is possible that could yield another kind of poll-defying result. But that equal intensity of Trump detractors kind of appears to more than counterbalance the enthusiastic support that he has marshaled amongst his base. Frankly, it's a bit late now, but for those very few voters who are still kind of persuadable or not sure what they're going to do, I think his best route with them would have been economic sensibilities and appealing to that, because a lot of people are very scared about that right now. But I think that's where we stand headed in to tomorrow. And I'll ask one last question that's coming through here. Cliff, right now, 80% of Americans say things are feeling out of control. Do you think that's going to improve by the end of the year and as a result of what happens in the next few days?
That's a good question. I do think if Biden wins, it will probably be the same. Right? There might be a slight uptick in optimism. We often see that after an election where you have, the losing side doesn't shift so much. It shifts down a bit, but the winning side really shifts up. But I think the backdrop of the coronavirus still is sort of clouding things. Again, you might have a honeymoon period, which you always do. But we still have the backdrop of the coronavirus. So the one thing we didn't talk about was, and we did a little bit at the beginning, but, the context is the coronavirus. That's how Americans see the world right now. Those are the lenses through which they see everything. And so perhaps a slight improvement, but more to the medium term, probably we're in the same place.
Okay, thanks. Chris, any other questions we need to be?
Two related questions. One asking, does Trump's strength have more to do with just his prevalence over the last 4 years and Biden not having the same level of visibility over the last 4 years?
Yeah, well, I think your point a moment ago about just the media saturation was very well taken. So yes, that's certainly an advantage. I mean, he's been the headliner for 4.5 years now, right? So certainly that carries plenty. Yeah, that was a good response. I'd go with that one. And what was the other question, Chris?
And then a related one is being the incumbent actually contributing to Trump's sort of brand strength relative to the competitor?
Yes, that would be my response. I don't know who the question's to, but incumbency, independent of a brand analysis, incumbency always has an advantage. Part of which is that the individual, the president or the sitting executive, if it's not a presidential system, is there and can take advantage of the bully pulpit, among other sorts of things. And so, yeah, I think the brand Trump is benefiting in part because of that. But there's a fundamental weakness as well. He hasn't performed so great during the coronavirus, and everyone sees it as such. And so, typically, yes, incumbency is important. There might be little cracks in that or kinks in that incumbency armor, given his poor performance on the coronavirus.
And I know. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, please go.
Oh, one more question is, should commercial brands be looking at negative attributes to understand people being pushed away from their brand, like Biden voters are being pushed away from Trump?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, definitely. I think as researchers, insights professionals, we're often guilty for overloading our surveys with attributes that tilt positive, and we miss some of these very relevant matters. And we also tend to measure things just in a standard ask and answer format, as opposed to speed-based formats like we've done here. And I think you put those two things together, and you get a much more realistic depiction of where your brand stands. So you want to not only look at things that are pulling people towards you, you want to look at those repulsion factors as well. And just to build on that last point Cliff made about incumbency, from a brand management standpoint, same goes, right? There is power to incumbency, especially if you're in a category where allocation of volume is not an issue, where it's a 1-0 game. Either have a provider or I don't. So services industry, high involvement goods, that type of thing. Incumbency definitely has its brand advantages. And with that, we're a few minutes over here, so sorry for going over a bit. Thank you all so much for all the questions and comments along the way. If there are follow-up items to which we need to attend afterwards, we're certainly happy to do that. So thanks everybody for spending so much time with us this afternoon. Hope you found this interesting, and let's have a great election day tomorrow.
And if you haven't, go vote.
Good luck. Good luck.
I just really want to thank Chris, and Cliff for today's really interesting presentation and for all your great questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If we didn't respond to your question, we will do so by email. And also by email, you will receive a direct link to today's recorded presentation. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.